I, Nelson Mandela, do hereby swear to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa. So help me God.
When Nelson Mandela was sworn in as President of South Africa in 1994, it was a moment of extraordinary history. For this man had spent 27 years in prison, serving a life sentence as a convicted terrorist. He'd led a campaign of violence, yet he'd also come to symbolize the struggle for black and white to live together in peace. This is the story of the prisoner who became president. Nelson Mandela was born in 1918. His home was Kulu, a small village sheltered from the outside world that lay deep in the province of Transkei in eastern South Africa. From the 19th century, this country had seen years of huge change. White settlers had flocked to South Africa. Drawn by the country's rich reserves of gold and diamonds, they'd forced Africans off their land and into the mines as cheap black labor. Mandela at first was protected from this world. When his own father died, he was adopted by the local chief and sent away to boarding school. At 19, he was a good student who dreamt of being a lawyer. But then he travelled north to the city of gold, Johannesburg, and there he learnt what it meant to be black in South Africa. Here he was treated as inferior. Like other black people, he was poorly paid, pushed to live in overcrowded shantytowns away from white homes. The injustice angered him. He joined the African National Congress, a group founded in 1912 to campaign for black rights. Its leaders had a polite and moderate style that soon frustrated Mandela. What he wanted were mass protests. So he started a youth league in 1944, and he soon made an impression.
He was very articulate, he was very sharp in thinking, and he was streetwise, involved in boxing, studying as a lawyer. He dressed in style, spoke in style, but he was convincing because he was honest. He was speaking about real issues of the day.
Then in 1948, the extremist Afrikaner National Party won the elections and began to create the system of apartheid, or separation. Under new racist laws, 2 million whites would rule 8 million blacks. Every South African was now classified by race. If you were black, you couldn't marry whites, you couldn't vote. You had to carry a pass book and get passes to work, to travel, even to go out at night. 8 million black people were now forced to move on to just 13% of the nation's worst land. Mandela had been elected General Secretary of the ANC Youth League in 1947. Now he began to organize a peaceful campaign of defiance against the new apartheid laws.
The defiance campaign of 1952 found that type of a spirit, the Mandela spirit, the man who said, look, let's show a different way. Let's go and defy their laws. Why don't we go out into the streets and show it with our numbers?
The police were ordered to stop the protests. Mandela became a banned person. It meant he was forbidden to speak at rallies, to attend meetings, or even leave Johannesburg. But it didn't stop his campaign growing in strength. In 1955, thousands marched to support a new freedom charter demanding the basic human rights that apartheid denied them. The government replied with mass arrests.
They just picked up people at the crack of dawn. Nelson was amongst them. It really turned our lives upside down. You were 156 people, most of them leaders, sitting in prison.
Almost every defiance campaign leader, black and white, was now charged with high treason, accused of calling for a violent revolution. They and Mandela faced a 4-year trial. There was one high point. He met and married Winnie Madikizela while he was out of prison on bail. But there was little time for celebration. Any peaceful defiance of apartheid was now being crushed by force. Mandela began to ask if the time had come for his people to fight back. Then in 1960 came a turning point. It began as a day of protest against the hated passbooks. But at Sharpeville outside Johannesburg, the police opened fire on the crowd. "200 people were wounded, many of them teenagers. More than 60 were killed. Sharpeville caused international outrage. In London, there were protest marches, and South Africa was forced out of the Commonwealth. Inside the country, the mood was tense. In Pretoria, the 4-year treason trial finally came to an end. Mandela and the others faced prison for their defiance campaign, but they were found not guilty of violence or treason. To the government's fury, the judges acquitted them. For Mandela, a face in the celebrating crowd, it was a moment of decision. Sharpeville had convinced him that the days of peaceful defiance were over. He decided to turn to violence. He went into hiding, leaving his young family behind. And in 1961, from a secret location, Mandela told the world the ANC had decided to take up the armed struggle.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
The acts of terrorism began soon after, and it was Mandela who led the military unit responsible. He knew people might be killed in their attacks, and later they were.
Every peaceful demonstration failed. There was nothing really left for us then, although a lot of people still felt that we shouldn't become a violent organization, including myself. I just couldn't think of violence. It was just not on for many people.
After the first attacks, Mandela was smuggled out of the country. He began a tour of Africa in 1962, raising money and support for his armed struggle. In July, he returned to continue the fight inside South Africa. He was disguised as a chauffeur when the police finally caught up with him. Mandela was arrested. On the 20th of April 1964, he was brought to court from prison. At the Palace of Justice in Pretoria, he was charged with sabotage. The penalty was death or life in prison. There, in a holding cell beneath the courtroom, he prepared a statement which was to stun the packed courtroom.
There were crowds of people inside and outside, and the police had great difficulty in controlling the crowd. There was a real tense atmosphere, people shouting slogans, people defying the judge.
From the dock, Mandela said the struggle against apartheid was worth more than his life.
I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony. If needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
Mandela knew, these are my last words, they'd better leave the kind of message for people to hang on, to hold on, and upon it, to fight on.
When this final sentence came, there was complete silence. That they were given life imprisonment. It was such a shock. I remember just bursting into tears. We couldn't contain ourselves. It was just so devastating. We felt as though it was the end of the struggle in a way.
But if the government thought imprisoning Mandela would silence his struggle, they were sorely mistaken. In June 1964, Mandela was taken by boat to South Africa's maximum security jail. It was 7 miles off the coast of Cape Town, and it was called Robben Island. Here, the ANC prisoners were held in an isolation block. Every day, Mandela and the others were made to dig rocks in the prison quarry. Their cells, just 7 foot square, were damp and often bitterly cold. But Mandela was an inspiration to his fellow prisoners.
Here I found a man, very calm, very dignified in the way he even walked in prison, and simply inspiring us by saying, this is also an area of struggle. And here we are so stripped of our dignity that the first battle is, while you do what you are expected to do as a prisoner, do it with dignity. Now, that immediately straightened your back.
As the years passed, the government made sure the only images the world saw of their prisoner Mandela were a handful of grainy photographs. But the struggle against apartheid went on, and it went on in his name. In the 1970s, a new generation of schoolchildren led riots in the Soweto township. These young people had never seen Mandela themselves, but from behind bars he'd become an even more powerful symbol of the struggle.
When I came out of prison, it was at the middle of the 1976 uprising. And the first question was, were you with Mandela? What sort of man is he? So the lack of knowledge about the man was also an inspiration because it raised the curiosity. As long as you knew that he had made the statement, I'm prepared to die, you were keen to ask, who's this man?
Mandela was now supported by an international anti-apartheid campaign. Demonstrations called for sanctions to cut off trade with South Africa, and in shops, customers refused to buy their goods. Some, like Mrs. Thatcher, were reluctant. Mandela's support of violence had made him a terrorist, she said, but later even she agreed to isolate the country. By the mid-80s, South Africa faced a crisis. Sanctions were hurting the economy, and across the country there was a massive black uprising.
Quite clearly, the isolation of the apartheid masters is total. It's complete. They feel like a lost tribe of white people in Africa now. All they have is military might. Somebody had to go to them to awaken them to the fact that they had lost.
The white minority government faced open warfare. They were running out of options. They turned to Mandela and offered his release if he would call off the armed struggle. Mandela refused. They must stop apartheid first. Pressure was building. In 1988, a free Mandela concert in London was broadcast around the world, and governments threatened further sanctions. From prison, Mandela knew the moment had come for talks with the government, and finally, a new president agreed.
I think we were equally tense before the meeting. I immediately liked him. I developed an appreciation for the concentration with which he listened. We walked away from that meeting with a feeling that we could do business with each other.
A deal was struck for Mandela's release. It made protests legal and promised talks on a vote for the black population. In February 1990, Nelson Mandela was released. The moment was broadcast live around the world.
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela. That is the man who the world has been waiting to see.
He had spent 27 years in prison. But Mandela showed no bitterness and promised whites that he and his people would not take revenge for apartheid.
I and the ANC are as opposed to black domination as we are to white domination. We must clearly demonstrate our goodwill to our white compatriots and convince them by our conduct and arguments that a South Africa without apartheid will be a better home for all.
But reconciliation between black and white would not be easy. In the tense, often hostile mood as the country headed for its first multiracial elections, Mandela's influence helped keep the peace. When polling day came on April the 27th, 1994, it was calm. For the first time in their lives, black South Africans had won the right to vote. Nelson Mandela had achieved his dream. The prisoner was elected president. Apartheid had left a terrible legacy. In a country of 50 million, 9 million were destitute, 23 million had no electricity, 6 million were unemployed. Mandela had led black South Africans to freedom, but he had also ensured a home for whites there too. Now a new generation must see if they can heal the scars.